All right, so now we are going to get started. We are going to talk about the Uberon anatomy ontology. So Damien and I are going to lead the session. I'm going to give a very brief overview with a little bit of historical context. Damien is going to give you an overview of the content and scope of the ontology, and then we will do a walk through some of the plentiful use cases of Uberon, which should give you a bit of a sense of the impact that the ontology has had in the last year. Those of you that have seen me give presentations before, I kind of like to start with a slide that shows a bit, this idea that in our domain, in the biomedical domain, everything are entities and everything is connected with each other. This slide has been shown in many other contexts as well. So you can see, yeah, we have some genes, and genes cause diseases. Diseases are associated with phenotypes, and phenotypes affect some anatomical, like in this case, an organ. And similarly, this gene has a function, which is a biological process, which occurs in some cell type, which in turn is part of a specific anatomical part or organ. And what I kind of like us to always kind of think about is when we are defining and relating and discussing ontologies, is that we are describing parts of this kind of interconnected world. And today we are going to focus, of course, there are many different kind of entities than these ones that we've seen here, and many more relationships between them. But this is kind of like a snapshot that is very, that you if you are familiar with the Monarch sort of initiative, you will recognize most of these. But today we are going to zoom in on this bottom part here, which is how we are representing anatomical parts, tissues, and generally structures. So Uberon as a whole is an obo ontology. I'm not going to say what obo is now, but most of you should know this already. You can browse Uberon metadata on the Obo Foundry website as well, and get some nice metadata about use cases, links to other sites that are using it, the grants that we're supporting it, and so on. And it forms an extremely significant part of the overall suite of Obo Foundry ontologies, as one of the, I think, top 10 most impactful and most important Obo ontologies there is. And what it kind of roughly, so we will hear more from later from Damien about this, but what it roughly covers are here, you see this blue box in the middle. It roughly covers these kind of anatomical parts, organs, and their interrelations. And I think the thing that makes it a bit more interesting than many other ontologies that we deal with is that that Uberon actually has multiple primary axes of, let's say, classification. Usually, most of you are mostly familiar with like the subclass of relationship that is the primary organizing relationship in most of the other ontologies that we are dealing with. But Uberon actually has a plethora of very important relationships, particularly the part of relationship. So you can see how you should see a reasonably complete picture of how the anatomical entities are mereologically related, or they are part of each other. You should see developmental relationship. How is one anatomical part developed from another and another and another and another, and of course the subclass relationships as well. That's kind of like the main sort of content, and the other is the relationship to species specific anatomy ontologies that we will hear about in Damien's parts, where we have links from the Uberon concept to species-specific anatomy ontologies. So the thing that most of you that are at least part of our kind of like wider effort, community efforts, they should kind of keep in mind is this sentence: Uberon is an anatomical ontology that represents body parts, organs, and tissues in a variety of animal species with a focus on vertebrates. So I didn't say that with the vertebrates, but I think that will get clearer in Damien's part as well. All right, I'm going to give a brief idea of the history. So Uberon was created in 2009 as a project that was mostly driven by a few people that most of you should recognize as like founding members of the Monarch initiative. So David Asumi Sutherland, Chris Munkel, and Melissa Handel. And in the early beginnings, I wasn't there, and most of you, I guess, weren't there either. But I may misrepresent some of the details here a little bit because I, of course, don't know all the details. But I think ontology was originally created with a very classic use case of having to logically define things in other ontologies. So last time, in the last OBO Academy session, we had a very detailed deep dive into, or not the last one, but the one before, into phenotype data and phenotype descriptions, and we will look at this later in this session as well. For these ones to describe phenotype terms computationally, anatomy terms obviously play a very important role, like for example, to describe the tissues in which a phenotype occurs. Similarly, this was one of the driving use cases back then. We had to define biological processes into gene ontology in definitions like this one down here. And we will look at this very briefly later in the use case section again. Then a few years later, we call this now the mid-period. This project pivots a bit more to a community project. So we have now multiple, and definitely this is not a complete picture, but just like to give you a sense, but multiple groups that are becoming stakeholders and contributors to Uberon, like Phenoscape, which is has a lot of like evolutionary developmental data, BG, which we will look at in a bit for gene expression data and gene ontology for pathway annotations. And it's now increasingly being used for things like metadata in records, cross-species integration, and database curation. And the last and the big phase is this phase between 2020 and 2024. We have a transition to a more full-blown community resource where now suddenly big groups and projects like HubMap, Human Cell Atlas, and all the mods and many different other projects are now becoming direct stakeholders and contribute to Uberon and making it a truly community-driven resource, and now being used for all these use cases I said before, plus many more like data discovery, which we will see some examples of later. All right. So with that, this is just a bit of history. I will pass over to Damien, who will tell you a little bit about the content and the scope of the ontology, and then we will discuss impact and use cases towards the end.
Okay, just 1 minute.
While we are waiting for Damien to put up his slides, are there so far any questions from anyone? I mean, this was very general, so probably not that much, but maybe someone wants to correct some wrong information that I've added to some of the slides that I should fix before the next time we give this talk. I'm very happy to hear mistakes for sure.
Nika, this is Jim. I was just at the very beginning of Uberon, it was not even my memory is that it wasn't even intended to be like a standalone ontology. It was this kind of mapping project that Chris was building, sort of all automatically over the different species-specific ontologies. And then it kind of got a life of its own.
I'm going to take a note immediately, and I will fold that in also into the next time we give this. Thanks for this. And I think that we will get a little bit more context about what Jim just said in the next part of the talk. So I'm going to silence myself. Thanks, Jim, for this comment, and we'll record it. Thanks.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Good. Okay, so sorry about that. So as Nico said, I will talk a little bit about the content that you can find in Uberon now. So starting with the scope of the ontology and its implications on the class hierarchy within the ontology. So as briefly mentioned by Nico in the introduction, the scope of Uberon is the animal anatomy with a particular focus on vertebrates. And I will come back in a moment to elaborate on what we mean by a focus on vertebrates. What we mean by the scope is the anatomy of animals. Obviously, it means that everything that is beyond the animal kingdom is out of scope for Uberon. So, for example, anything about plants, about unicellular organisms such as bacteria or viruses, for example, that's completely out of scope for Uberon. Also out of scope is anything that is not wild type or not normal for some value of normal. So for example, Uberon will not attempt to describe abnormal morphology, such as congenital defects or things like that. And also out of scope is anything beyond the resolution of the tissue. So if you need to describe things at the level of individual cells, then most likely you will rather use the cell ontology. And if you need to go even deeper than that and to describe things at the level of organelles, then most likely you would rather use the cellular component branch of the gene ontology rather than Uberon. So to come back a little bit to the history, so as Nico mentioned, Uberon was initiated in 2009. So at a time where there already existed several other ontologies, species-specific ontologies out there. And some of them were directly in the years that followed the creation of Uberon. A few of those specific ontologies were actually directly merged into Uberon and no longer exist, are no longer maintained as independent, separate ontologies. So that's the case, for example, of the teleost anatomy ontology, the vertebrate skeleton anatomy ontology, the vertebrate homology, not remember exactly what the acronym stands for, but no, it doesn't matter. So this VHOG anatomy and the amphibian anatomy ontology, all those four ontologies no longer exist independently. They are instead directly embedded within Uberon. As for the other ontologies, such as the zebrafish anatomy ontology, or the xenopus anatomy ontology, or the mouse anatomy ontology, they still exist. They are simply, their terms are mapped to Uberon terms in ways that I will describe a little bit later. So no, this scope means that Uberon is supposed to cover the entire diversity of the animal kingdom, which means in particular that Uberon needs very generalized abstractions that can fit the diversity of animal structures. And if you want, you can replace diversity in this sentence by weirdness of animal structures. That will be accurate as well. So for example, this means that we cannot simply have terms such as cardiovascular system or heart, because that will be too much vertebrate specific. Instead, we need more generalized terms such as circulatory system with subclasses to cover the different cases of closed circulatory system, which is the kind of circulatory system that most people are familiar with in vertebrates. But also, we need also to cover the case of open circulatory systems, such as the one we can find in arthropods, for example. And similarly, instead of simply a term for heart, which would only describe the vertebrate heart, we need a more general term such as circulatory organ, which will cover all cases of basically any kind of organ that can pump a substance within an organism. And so the Uberon general term for heart is what we call the primary circulatory organ, which covers the cases of the vertebrate heart, but also the dorsal vessel heart, which is the equivalent of a heart in arthropods, such as, for example, in fruit flies. Now, what do we mean when we say that the focus of the ontology is on vertebrates? One way to illustrate that is to look at the term for the vertebrate heart and to look at all the terms that represent parts of the vertebrate heart. So if you look at the vertebrate heart, and if you look at all the terms that are linked to vertebrate heart using part-of relationships, you will find quite a handful of terms representing all the different sections of the heart, the septums, the valves, the different layers around the heart, and all the arteries that irrigate the heart one way or another. So overall, the vertebrate heart is quite well described entirely within Uberon. But if you try to do the same thing to look for similar terms under the dorsal vessel heart, which is the term representing the heart of arthropods, you would actually find within Uberon nothing at all. In Uberon, we have a term for dorsal vessel heart, and there are no terms that are linked to dorsal vessels using part-of relationships. And the reason for that is that within Uberon, precise description of non-vertebrate anatomy is delegated to taxon-specific ontologies. So non-vertebrate terms in Uberon are merely intended to act as branching points to which we can attach terms coming from taxon-specific ontologies. So for example, dorsal vessel heart is intended as a branching point to which we can attach terms coming, for example, from FBBT, the anatomy for fruit flies, which does contains more terms to accurately describe the anatomy of the dorsal vessel in flies. Which leads us to one way to describe actually Uberon. Uberon is a mix of three different things. First, it's a generic framework of high-level terms to describe anatomy in a taxon-neutral way. It's also a complete ontology to describe vertebrate anatomy, or rather an ontology that aims to be complete to describe vertebrate anatomy. Of course, as any similar project, the work to do that is never fully done, so it's always an ongoing project, but the aim is certainly to completely and accurately describe vertebrate anatomy. And it's also a hub to connect all taxon-specific ontologies through what I call here taxon-specific placeholders. So terms such as dorsal vessel heart or things like that, to which we can attach terms coming from the taxon-specific ontologies. So if we go back to our example of circulatory organ, so terms such as circulatory organ, primary circulatory organ, or accessory circulatory organ, that's part of the generic framework to describe a taxon-neutral anatomy. Then terms such as heart and all the terms that are related to it to describe the precise parts of the vertebrate heart are part of the complete ontology to describe vertebrate anatomy. And then terms such as dorsal vessel heart or lymph heart are the placeholders that we can use to attach terms from taxon-specific ontologies such as FBBT, WBBT, and other taxon-specific ontologies like that. No. All are taxon-specific ontologies integrated, all are terms from those taxon-specific ontologies attached to those placeholder terms. So that's what I will cover now. And for that, we need to introduce those four concepts of cross-ontology mappings, cross-ontology bridges, collected ontologies, and composite ontologies. So cross-ontology mappings are actually not a concept that is specific to Uberon. You can have cross-ontology mappings between any kind of ontologies and not only between Uberon and the taxon-specific ontologies. But the bridges and the notion of collected ontology and composite ontology, that is quite Uberon-specific parlance that we need to be described in a little bit more details. So for the cross-ontology mappings, again, that is not specific to Uberon. A cross-ontology mapping is simply a statement that says that one term in one ontology is mapped somehow, linked somehow to another term in another ontology. So in the case of the mappings between Uberon and the taxon-specific ontologies, those mappings have a precise meaning. For example, if we look at this, this mapping here, where Uberon 15,230, so that's the term representing dorsal vessel heart, is mapped to the term SPD 130 from the spider anatomy ontology. So this mapping means that SPD 130, that term in the spider anatomy ontology, represents the spider-specific form of Uberon's dorsal vessel heart term. So those mappings, for most of them, except the mappings with LVBT, they are maintained within Uberon itself. So they are maintained by Uberon editors under the form of cross-references within the ontology itself. Internally, Uberon is using those mappings to produce the bridges, as I will describe in a moment. But we also publish the entirety of those mappings since last December, I think. We publish the entirety of those mappings as a SSOM set so that they can be reused by any other project that for one reason or another will need to manipulate the mappings between Uberon terms and terms from taxon-specific ontologies. So as for the bridges are merely an whole representation of the mappings. So a mapping, as I said, is just a statement that one term, for example, from the spider anatomy ontology is mapped to one term in Uberon. A cross-ontology bridge is just an whole file that contains all axioms that materialize those kind of statements. So for example, the mapping that I mentioned just earlier between the spider heart and the Uberon dorsal vessel, it is materialized within the bridge between Uberon and the spider anatomy ontology as an axiom that says that SPD 130 is equivalent to Uberon 15,230 that is part of the taxon representing spiders. So basically, it's a form of, it's the mappings in a form that is directly usable by any tool that can manipulate all files, such as Protégé, such as Robot, such as all tools, or any other tools that can manipulate all files with all API or the Ontology Access Kit or any other tool like that. Whereas mappings, for example, mappings represented using SSOM or cross-references need some kind of special tooling in order to be manipulated. Whereas the bridges are directly usable. You can directly merge them, for example, using robot merge without any kind of special tooling, because that's just plain all files. So internally, we use the bridges to produce the collected ontologies. And again, we also publish the bridge files so that they can be reused by other projects. One known user of those bridges, for example, is the Ubergraph project, which use them to merge Uberon with, among other things, some of the taxon-specific ontologies, and to make sure that when those ontologies are merged together, we have the proper relationship between terms from Uberon and terms from the taxon-specific ontologies. And the link here below will get you to our current documentation of our bridging process if you want to know more about how those bridges are maintained and produced. So now we get to what we call the collected multi-species ontology. So that is a really Uberon-specific parlance, what we call a collected ontology is basically a merge between Uberon, CL, and at least one taxon-specific ontologies, possibly several of them, along with their corresponding bridges. So we can provide collected ontologies for all those taxon-specific ontologies. So for example, if you merge Uberon, CL, FBBT, which is a Drosophila anatomy ontology, and FBDV, which is ontology representing life stages in Drosophila, along with the Uberon to FBBT bridge and the CL to FBBT bridge, you end up with what we call the collected Drosophila ontology, which is an ontology that will contain all terms from Uberon, all terms from FBBT and FBDV, with the FBBT and FBDV terms appropriately positioned within the Uberon hierarchy, attached to their placeholder terms, as we've seen before, thanks to the bridges that we've generated previously. Similarly, if you merge Uberon, CL, WBBT, WBLS, along with their corresponding bridges, then you end up with collected worm. And similarly, you can get collected zebrafish, collected xenopus, collected tetrapod if you merge all those species-specific ontologies along with Uberon and CL. And we provide like that a few combinations of merged products up to the final product, which is collected metazoan, which is basically Uberon, CL, and all those taxon-specific ontologies along with their bridges merged together. So, importantly, collected metazoan is actually the only of the collected ontologies that we do provide in a pre-built form. So if you need one of the other collected ontologies, so for example, if you need collected Drosophila or collected worm, for now, you need to build it yourself, basically by cloning the Uberon repository. Make sure that you have all the tooling. Typically, mostly you will need the ontology development kit, and then explicitly ask to build the collected worm, for example, ontology. We only provide collected metazoan because presumably that's the one most people will be interested in. And as far as I know, nobody has ever explicitly requested any of the more specific collected products. If you do have a need for for example, to a pre-built collected worm or collected zebrafish, we can certainly update our release pipeline to just make sure that we build this one at the same time as we do a release. But for now, we do not do that. So here, if we again go back to our running example of the circulatory organ hierarchy, in collected Drosophila, when you merge Uberon, CL, and FBBT along with the Uberon to FBBT bridge, you end up with this excerpt here, in which terms from FBBT, such as the term representing art in Drosophila and the terms representing precise parts of the Drosophila art, are attached to the placeholder terms representing the dorsal vessel art in all arthropods. So that's the collected ontologies. Now, the other kind of product that we provide is what we call the composite ontologies, which are merely intended to address one possible flow, or maybe not flow, but at least let's say an annoyance of the collected ontologies, which are that collected ontologies are highly latticed and can be a little bit cumbersome to navigate throughout. So, because if we again go back to this example here, once you merge Uberon and FBBT, you end up here with both the term representing the dorsal vessel art in all arthropods and the FBBT term representing specifically the fly art. So if you just merge Uberon and FBBT, that's still manageable enough. But if you merge other species-specific ontologies, you could end up with a lot of terms. One term representing, for example, so the fly-specific art, one term to represent the spider-specific art, and so on. And you have another example here. If we look here at the ovary, I don't know if the screenshot is large enough, but here we have the Uberon term. Can you see my pointer? Can someone quickly say me?
It's a bit, we can see the pointer, but it's a bit small, the writing.
Okay. Okay, so even if you can read, so here we have the term representing the Uberon term for ovary. Below that, you have all the different parts of the ovary that you can find in Uberon. And here in this green box, you have the Drosophila ovary that you get by merging FBT with Uberon. And below that, you have all the different parts of the fly ovary. So to create the composite ontology, composite ontology is basically what we do is that we remove this level here. We remove the taxon-specific terms whenever possible. That is, whenever we already have a taxon-neutral terms that represent exactly the same thing. So in composite Drosophila, here on the right, you still have here on top the Uberon term for ovary, but this time, all the terms representing the parts of the fly ovary are directly attached to the Uberon term for ovary, and we no longer have a term representing specifically the fly ovary. So here, another example, if we again go back to our running example of circulatory organ, the difference between collected Drosophila here and composite Drosophila is that in composite Drosophila, terms such as arch chamber or aortic funnel, which represent various parts of the fly dorsal vessel, are directly attached to the Uberon term representing dorsal vessel art in all arthropods. We no longer have an intermediate level representing specifically the fly art. So with that in mind, between Uberon itself, collected products such as collected metazoan, or composite products such as composite metazoan, which one should you use? First question that you will need to ask, obviously, is, are you interested in describing anatomy in beyond vertebrates? If not, if you're only interested in vertebrate anatomy, then you can just use Uberon itself, possibly coupled with CL if you need to go beyond the tissue resolution. But if you need anatomy, if you need terms covering anatomy beyond vertebrates, then depending on what you do and depending on how you do it, you will use either composite metazoan or collected metazoan. My take is that if you just need to browse terms, if you don't need to annotate data, most likely you would rather use composite metazoan, which is slightly nicer to browse because it does not have unnecessary intermediate levels because they are explicitly pruned away, as I've just explained. But if you need to annotate data, if you do any kind of data curation and you need terms from Uberon to annotate, for example, you need to annotate which body parts a given sample comes from, for example, then you need to be careful. And most likely you should rather use collected metazoan. The reason for that is there are actually mostly two reasons for that. The first is that it's much more practical for species-specific curators to use collected metazoan because of the way collected metazoan is built, any term that is valid in a taxon-specific ontologies is a valid term in collected metazoan. Because collected metazoan is just Uberon merged with all the taxon-specific ontologies without any terms removed at all. So if you have a term that FBT term that is valid within FBT, that term is valid within collected metazoan. That is not necessarily true in composite metazoan, because in composite metazoan, we remove some taxon-specific terms whenever we can. So, for example, if we again go back to this example here, in collected metazoan, or in collected Drosophila, if you just merge only Uberon and AVBT, you have the AVBT term representing the fly art, whereas in composite metazoan, you do not have this term. Instead, you should use the term, the Uberon term representing the dorsal vessel art in all arthropods. And what this also means is that in composite ontologies, for some terms, you might lose the taxon-specific bit of information if you annotate to composite terms instead of annotating to collected metazoan terms. Because, for example, if you have a sample that comes from a fly sample that comes from the fly dorsal vessel, and you need a term to annotate it before you can store it in a database or whatever, if you use composite metazoan, the only term you will find in composite metazoan that can accurately describe the fly art is this term, dorsal vessel art. But this term represents the dorsal vessels across all arthropods. So you cannot represent the fact that this sample is from a fly art, unless you have in your database schema or in your annotation form or whatever, you have a distinct taxon field in which you can separately record the precise species your sample is coming from. So overall, the key takeaway here is that for most purposes, I believe you should rather use collected metazoan rather than composite metazoan, unless you know precisely what you're doing and you know that the terms that are removed from the composite ontologies to make them slightly easier to navigate, you will not miss those terms for your specific purpose. Now, I will quickly go through a couple of other features of Uberon before we can go to the use cases with Nico. So first, about the integration with CL. So that integration is actually goes quite deep, and basically I like to present CL as merely Uberon once you go below the tissular level. CL has the same scope and the same focus as Uberon. So the scope is animal cell types, and the focus is on vertebrate cell types. It has the same integration with species-specific ontologies using the same mechanisms, the same bridges. And CL is automatically included in all collected and composite ontologies. So, in fact, to put things simply, you can simply consider that Uberon and CL is just a single project that happens to be split in two distinct repositories just for ease of management. But it's really a single project with mostly the same persons involved in both. And lastly, another features of Uberon that might be useful for some, again, for some use cases. We provide subsets of the ontology. If you, for some reason, you do not need the entire ontology, we provide both system-specific subsets. For example, if you only need terms describing the circulatory systems, describing the digestive systems, the excretory systems, the immune systems, and so on. And we also provide taxon-specific systems if you just want terms that represent structures that exist in amniotes, terms that represent structures that exist in human, in mouse, in xenopus, and so on. But here you should be careful of not confusing those subsets with the collected and composite ontologies. A subset such as, for example, amniote basic, it's a subset of Uberon itself and only Uberon itself. It will not contain any terms from the taxon-specific ontologies that cover the various amniotes. Same, for example, if you look at the Xenopus view, it will contain the Uberon terms that concern structures that do exist in Xenopus, but it will not contain any terms coming from the Xenopus anatomy ontology. So make sure that you are not confused between the Xenopus view of Uberon, which is a subset of Uberon containing only terms valid for Xenopus, and collected Xenopus or composite Xenopus, which contains the whole of Uberon and the whole of the Xenopus anatomy ontology. And with that, I'm done with my description of Uberon's contents, and I go back to Nico for the discussion of use cases.
Thank you, Damien. Awesome. Yeah, I've directed everyone to ask questions in the chat so that we can get through everything. And yeah, we are both available for answering questions in the chat. So can someone confirm that you see the slide impact and use cases?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. All right. So first of all, a quick disclaimer, I'm not an expert in most of the data and resources that I'm presenting in the next, or that I'm browsing through in the following 10 minutes. So I may be misrepresenting some of that a little bit, but the point is not to give like a kind of detailed account of what these resources are doing, but really also to give everyone a sense of the immense and huge impact that ontologies that we are building has on the outside world, like outside in the sense of really outside of our own environments, like Monarch and Obo. So I decided to group this part here by use cases. And so the first use case that I will go through is data annotation and discovery. Most of you that are working in biomedical domain know that this is kind of like the most prevalent of all ontology related use cases out there. We annotate data in model organism databases, in any kind of scientific database, and we then want to leverage ontologies, for example, for search and other kinds of discovery tools. And I'm going to show you a few examples of how and where this is done using Uberon. So for example, here you can see how Campbell is using Uberon to annotate data about drug targets and their biological activities, and also for their tissue report cards. I've also, for all of these resources, or most of them in any case, I also put a link down here. So if you want to explore this a little bit more, then feel free. I'm not going to dive in detail. The point of this section is really just to give you a broad stroke idea of like the variety of places where Uberon is used, rather than anything very specifically deep. Here in the Phantom 5 Star project, Uberon is used to annotate data about tissue-specific gene expression and regulatory networks. So apart from simply just grouping data that they have, or data sets that they have using Uberon terms, they also provide an Uberon powered enrichment analysis widget on their sites where they present something which I don't know what it is. Sorry, enriched with the ontology terms that are presented on the specific site. Then we have other portals like this one here, this one, the Phantom 5, and this one here, the SC Portaling 2, are both hosted in Riken in Japan. This is for annotating data about single-set transcriptomics profiles across various tissues, and you can just see this is like a box standard use case where you have metadata, you want to have metadata descriptions about data sets, and you want to say, okay, this has been for example, an assay or something that is related to the islet of Langerhans using the Uberon ontology. So here, this is really a use case about data standardization, and that's kind of like what most of these previous use cases were about as well. CZI is cell-to-gene. I don't know whether this is how you pronounce this name, but cell-to-gene, I'm assuming, uses Uberon. primarily it's using CL, of course, but it's also using Uberon, and so you can see up here for grouping the results by tissues and organs. And one thing that I want to point out here is that, and we don't see this often enough. Like we see this in OLS, but we don't really see this very often in many of the tools that our ontologies are leveraged in. You can see nicely how this display here is, in this case CL, exploiting the structure of the ontology as well for display, not just making the data available or searchable using ontology terms. So this is kind of cool, and I think there are a few browsers like Virtual Frybrain and others that do this as well, and of course Monarch. But this happens less often than one might think. Intellex is a term browser that uses Uberon as a source as a recommended source to annotate neuroscientific data related to anatomical structures. So this is basically kind of like a OLS type infrastructure that is then used by tools and infrastructures. I think, I'm not sure exactly whether this is technically true, but it's definitely conceptually true, by structures like the Neuroscience Information Framework to power data discovery. So for example, you can, if you autocomplete in their search box, similar to what you would get from OLS, you would see Uberon terms indexed based on labels and synonyms. Another important reminder how important synonyms are, and doing them right for every one of you that is building ontologies. And making the resource and these data sets discoverable. There are a few other which I will browse over because of time limitations, like the ENCODE Data Coordination Center, Phenoscape, of course, which did a lot of work using which was a lot. It was influenced a lot by Uberon. So in their Phenoscape KB, you can see nice pages which are indexed by Uberon terms and then links to related phenotypic descriptions and other things. Gene Ontology, of course, using Uberon heavily to provide additional context information for their pathway annotations. Then we have other projects. This list could be going on endlessly, and the point really is here to swamp you with the fact that there are a lot of different projects out there that are using Uberon for these kinds of use cases. Here, this is just another nice one. FaceBase, which is using Uberon to annotate data about craniofacial development and anomalies. So you can see here the data sets that are being indexed using Uberon terms. So you can search for all the data sets based on Uberon anatomy terms, and they're all grouped under these pages again. And of course, the hub map pages that also have Uberon as a primary organizing ontology, which have nice 3D browsers. So for the reference atlas widgets, and again allow us to search through Uberon and get to these respective pages. All right, this gave a bit of a sense. I think the main thing I want to get across here is there are a huge number of resources. There are a lot of these are not even nearly all of them. There are many resources that are cut here for brevity, but what I want to get away here is that these ontologies, they do have downstream stakeholders. Changing things like synonyms and structures does have repercussions, and I think for people that are involved in like grant committees and things like that, it's really important reminders that these basic resources need to be funded to address the needs of these ever-growing sets of stakeholders. All right, the next use case is data integration and knowledge graph. So this is about connecting data across resources. Of course, I will mention Monarch, which is produces my favorite knowledge graph, an integrated knowledge graph about phenomics data across species. And here you can see in the bottom part down here, the anatomy layer that is powered by Uberon and CL, which integrates all of these species-specific ontologies in the way that Damien described before, which in turn are the entry point into all of these different model organism and other kinds of databases, like, for example, the BG gene expression database, which we will see in a second. And these kind of integrated knowledge graphs allow us to, group data across a lot of different resources. You can see, search for terms like Uberon terms and find data related to those Uberon terms similar to the other resources as well. BG is a big user of these composite files that Damien described before. So they integrate gene expression patterns across different species using Uberon, and in particular using the Uberon composite files. And of course, Ubergraph, which I forgot to put on before, but I now remembered when I heard Damien speaking before, as one of our knowledge graphs of choice for accessing information across OBO ontologies developed by Jim. All right, the third use case, and I know we are going towards the end, so I'm going to browse through this quickly, is the defining ontology concept logically that involve anatomy. So here, what I want to sensitize you towards a little bit is, we've talked a lot in recent sessions about eupheno and phenotype data integration, and one thing that I kind of want to point out and make us remember is that a lot, okay, eupheno is amazing, the efforts we are doing is amazing, but the fact that we can integrate a lot of phenotypes across species stems in no small part to all this integrated anatomical information that we find in Uberon. Yeah? So a large proportion of what we call eupheno integration comes actually from anatomy integration in Uberon. And so what this means is that actually Uberon itself will impact the performance of diagnostic tools like, for example, Exomizer, when it comes to comparing variant prioritization that exploits cross-species phenotype information, like we discussed a few weeks ago. And this is just a reminder how these things also interconnect a lot with each other, and that decisions we make in Uberon actually do have impact on diagnostic yield in advanced downstream diagnostic tools such as Exomizer. I'm going to skip through this. There are more than 70 ontologies in OBO alone that do use Uberon for defining logical axioms and standardization, like diseases in Mondo and DO, assays in OB, traits in OBA, and many, many more. And of course, it's used as an upper layer in many species-specific anatomy ontologies that are going beyond the ones that Damien described before, for example, insect skeletal ontologies like ISAM that uses Uberon as a sort of upper layer for their ontology development without being formally part of the Uberon infrastructure. Unfortunately, I will not be able to kind of make this point very strongly. It is a bit outside of the normal part of the use case description, but one thing that I think we as a community driving Uberon should be very proud of is seeing it as a model project for community ownership and coordination. So I want to point out this use case for Uberon as well. It's a showcase, it's a thing to brag about how different groups can organize around a single community-owned ontology project. And of course, we all know this kind of picture, wow, it looks cool, looks romantic. All these different groups contribute to the same ontology, but the truth is when you look at the details, you will have lots of disagreements, philosophical differences, and problems that need to be reconciled. And I think Uberon is one of these projects that really stroke a good balance to integrate different viewpoints and manage this kind of debate. So especially for those of you that are deeply involved, I just want to thank you very specifically about making this such an awesome community-driven resource. We will tell you a little bit more about how Uberon and some other ontologies are specifically doing community coordination and community-based workflows as part of the IGBO 2024 course that Nicole Vasilevsky and I am organizing. So if you are interested in this, feel free to check this out and come join us. All right, wrapping up. So Uberon is an anatomical ontology that represents body parts, organs, and tissues in a variety of animal species with a focus on vertebrates. We said it, the little sentence you learn by heart. It integrates other species-specific anatomy ontology and provides a rich set of relations between anatomical terms. And it's used in a lot of different use cases and has a great impact from data annotation and discovery to data integration, logical structuring of ontologies, and being a model for biological, for being a community managed resource. So with that, I want to thank you for listening. Very sorry for not having a lot of time for answering questions today. I will stay a bit longer. I will expect most of you to leave, of course, now, so don't feel shy to leave now in the hour. I want to point out thank you to the NHGRI, to the Phenomics First grants for helping us organize these seminar series. And if you want to join us, we have the Slack, Obo Foundry Slack, and the specific anatomy and cell ontology Slack. If you want to join there, just open an issue in Uberon or send us an email, and we will get you on board. All of you, fingers crossed. We have a big grant involving also Damien. That could finance a lot of Uberon moving forward. Please make sure that you include Uberon in your prayers in the next year so that we get this grant through. So with that, that's it. Thank you very much.